So when I moved to Austin in 1998, this is the image of Austin that I saw. And it was beautiful outside, sunny. I came here in March. It was wonderful weather, kind of like you have today. And dogs were outside. There's 1 million dogs in the river, people running around the lake with them. Everybody seemed really happy. And so I was pretty shocked to find out that 14,000 animals were dying that year in our shelter. And in preparation for this talk, I actually went back and looked at a lot of the Austin history, and surprisingly, there's a ton that I didn't know, and it totally opened my eyes to kind of the whole trajectory of Austin from the beginning of animal sheltering to where we are now. So I wanted to walk you through what I learned because I think it's super fascinating. The first thing is that we didn't have a shelter at all until 1894, actually after 1894, and the only reason we developed an animal shelter was because of rabies. And so there was mass hysteria going on every single day. There was an article about mad dogs running the streets of Austin and causing people to get rabies. And I couldn't find any actual reports of a person getting rabies, but there were tons of reports of livestock, whole herds of hogs getting rabies, dogs running around and biting 1 million different animals. And so what the city was doing to try to control that was sending officers out and just shooting dogs on the spot. So shooting mad dogs on the spot in people's yards, in the street, wherever they were. As it kept going, the officers, the city tried to create a little bit more organization around it, and so they did create a dog pound. And the reason for that is that there was public outcry about the number of dogs that were actually valuable, in quotes, being shot on the spot without the owner being able to come get them. So they created the dog pound to take all the dogs to, so that the valuable ones would have a chance to be reclaimed by their owners, and there'd still be a way to get them off the streets. And I was really interested in this last sentence on here, that the executioners have the admiration and envy of the balance of the force. And I thought that was so bizarre because it just doesn't seem like that would be a really glamorous job. But if you think about it in the context of rabies and a rabies outbreak, and you're actually like, this is the thing that's saving the city from this massive rabies outbreak and people dying and other animals dying. So I thought that was also really interesting. As I moved on, in 1903, there was one officer who was the dog catcher for like 20 years, and he starts out in 1903 saying that he really hated to have to kill them, but he felt like he had to because it was his duty to protect the public, which totally makes sense in that context. And that the other fascinating thing about this is I realized that the Dog Days of Summer is all about rabies. I had no idea what that was until I started reading all these articles, that it's all about that they thought rabies could only be caught in the summer, and mad dogs only existed in the summer because of the heat. And so the pounds were only open for 4 months of the year to begin with, because that's when they thought dogs could spread rabies. So fast forward a little bit, there's a Humane Society that started, and the Humane Society was actually there to help people and animals. It wasn't just an animal Humane Society. And I think I might have heard that in the past, but I guess I didn't really recognize that was a thing. So they were helping kids, they were helping people who lost their homes, they were helping animals who lost their homes, they were helping animals that were being neglected or abused. And that was obviously a good thing. The city continues to try to deal with this rabies thing. They started to incentivize the officer to find more dogs and get them off the streets before they became mad, and then he was given funding to hire other people to go round up dogs. So they were incentivized to go pick up pets or loose dogs. Same thing, 1924, the pound is open. I was really struck by the language of a lot of these articles, and this one talks about how the shelter became quite overpopulated, the pound became quite overpopulated through the activity of Officer Evans. And we don't talk about it like that. We talk about overpopulation in the community, but we don't talk about overpopulation in the shelter in this context, and it's the first it's the first time that overpopulation was used in the newspaper was in 1924, which I thought was also really fascinating. Then complaints started to roll in. So people who went to the pound to try to find their dogs were really horrified by the conditions. There's other articles that I read, like 100 articles, so it was hard to find the ones that struck me early on, but there was one about how that they just didn't clean them. They held the dogs for 3 days and they might have fed them. They didn't have to feed them. They got complaints about not feeding them, and so then they would throw them some meat from the slaughter area that was right next to the pound, but they didn't have to do anything for them for 3 days. So the dogs were all in these big pens, and they were little dogs, big dogs, puppies, and they were just having a really huge problem for inhumane circumstances. Let's see. There was an article also about how if the main dog catcher wanted help, he could hire it out of his own pocket. So basically, there was one person to pick up the dogs and shoot them, and no other help available, funding-wise. The community's now looking for their pets. The pound, it turns out, moved at least 6 times that I could find in 30 years. And I don't know why that was. I don't know if it's because they were doing this seasonal thing, or if it was because there was that people were trying to break out the pets, or if it was because there was so many complaints. I don't really know. I couldn't figure out why they kept moving around, but it was in basically every sector of the city. 1929, they don't even call it anything but a death house, and they are trying to get more serious about rabies control. It was sort of scattershot, I guess no pun intended on that, until 1930s, and they were just trying to round up any random dog that they could find. It wasn't necessarily a organized city effort. And they moved to 5 days of holding them for their owner to find them, probably because of continued complaints. And this is also the first time that they started allowing people to take pets that weren't claimed by their owner. So in 1929, they put them on the auction block, and citizens could come not adopt them, they could buy them, or they'd be shot right on the other side of the auction block. 1930, people were breaking out pets. I was really struck by that, and what Kristen just said about how people love their pets. They may not have the best circumstances, but people who couldn't afford the tax would go and just cut the wires of the shelter or the pound and let out all the dogs, let out their group of dogs, which would tend to be a lot of dogs because they were all in the same pen. And there's article after article after article about this. It was a huge problem. The police were really annoyed by it. And that's another reason why I think maybe they were moving the pound around. Again, moving another one, created another pound, moved this one out of town. And then the other thing that happened in 1935 is that Texas mandated that pounds have a concrete floor, not because of the animals, but because they thought that rabies was living in the soil. So they created a pound with slightly better circumstances, but it was only because that's how they thought the disease was transmitted, not because they were worried about the animals. 1936, this is kind of the extent of how terrified the city was about rabies. 23,000 brains inspected in 10 years, and of those, 6,000 people had been treated for rabies exposure. And this guy, Albert Payson Terhune, he was an author. He wrote the book Lad, about a collie. And anyway, he's talking about how the pound was better than it was when he was a kid, but still a horrifying experience and 100% a place of hopelessness. And this article, this guy, I don't know if he's sort of the beginning of the movement of sterilizing pets and trying to control the population in a more humane way, but he talks about it later in this article, which I thought was really interesting too, because that's the first time it's mentioned, at least in the Statesman. The 1940, the city decides that shooting them is distasteful, and so they bought a gas chamber and brought it out to wherever this pound happened to be next to the electric department, and started using that instead. And I think it's really fascinating that they thought the gas chamber was more humane than shooting dogs. In 1948, more complaints. The dogs are crowded together in wire cages on wet and dirty cement floors. Newborn puppies, big dogs, vicious dogs, sick and crippled dogs, mangy dogs, starving and dead dogs, and spoiled food and filth are all in one mess together with flies over all. So it sounds like there really wasn't much improvement in the humane care of animals in the pound. And then same thing, another complaint, there's a person talking about how they went to the pound to try to find, I guess they went to go find their pet, but they were talking about a different pet later, and how our beloved pet, who happens to be a cur, is valuable to us, and luckily was not there. Had he been there sharing bones with obviously sick dogs, he probably wouldn't have remained healthy. So more complaints coming in, and the accusation that they're hiding the pound from the public because they think this person is sort of making an allegation that it's because of the horribleness of the shelter and people not wanting to find it. However, how do you find your pet if you can't find the shelter, can't find the pound? 1951, I guess they got rid of the gas chamber and started shooting dogs again. I don't really know how they made decisions at that time, but 1951 just doesn't feel that long ago. It is really perplexing to me that that we as a city were shooting dogs at this point. And this 1951 marked a period, actually I think it was 1948, from 1948 to about 1951, 52, they had started this continuous quarantine of the entire city. So the entire city was under quarantine. Nobody's pet was allowed out of their home unless it was on a leash. And every single dog in the entire, they had a whole mass of people rounding up dogs, bringing them to the pound. And in the course of about 2 years, 17,000 dogs were rounded up and killed, which is kind of unbelievable because 1951, Austin was a tiny town. The other thing that came out of this whole era was that an unintended consequence of saying, keep your dogs in your home, is people stopped vaccinating their dogs. The vaccine came out in the 40s for rabies, and people were getting their dogs vaccinated and hoping that would help prevent their dog from getting rabies, but somehow they thought if their dog was in their house or in their yard that they wouldn't be able to get rabies, so they'd stop vaccinating their dogs, which I thought was really interesting, and anyway, we'll talk more about that. And there were 77 positive cases in 1949 of dogs having rabies. 1951, I love this. This little boy is, I guess, marking the end of quarantine, and the statesman's out taking photos of him on his lawn, taking off the collar and letting his dog run free because the quarantine was over, which is such a foreign concept. The Humane Society is still at it in the background. They are helping animals. They're doing this more of the touchy-feely stuff. They're trying to get animals treated and then get them into homes. They're doing advertising for adopters. They're treating injured and ill animals, and they're kind of taking whatever they can handle. Somewhere between 1951 and 1955, the Humane Society burnt down with animals in it, and so they were out of a shelter, and they started working with the city to take over impoundment for the city. And I can't figure out why. I couldn't find any articles that explained why they did this, but I'm guessing maybe it was because of the inhumane conditions of the animals living in the pound. I don't know why they did that. There was an article previously where the head of the American Humane Association had been visiting the director of the Humane Society, and I wonder if maybe that was part of the humane movement, is they were asking humane societies to take over pounds for that reason. I don't really know, but it's really interesting. They show a picture of this little boy very happy with the dog, and under it, it says, we're expecting a terrible influx of dogs as soon as we start enforcing this more, and the Humane Society is going to do it all. This is a Dear Abby-like article, and the Loves Animals person says, it's my understanding that humane societies are selling their animals for experiments, and so this person is explaining kind of the facts of life about shelters, or about the Humane Society, and saying that they obviously hope they'll get adopted, but only to very good homes after careful screening, and if a home can't be found, the animal is put to sleep by the most humane method known to science, a decompression chamber. While this seems cruel, it is better than letting an animal die of starvation or exposure outside the shelter. And not all SPCA's release animals for experimental purposes, but if the public supported their shelter, animals could be kept longer and given more opportunities. So you start to see the rhetoric. It's really fascinating. None of that existed, and then all of a sudden there's this rhetoric about how the public isn't doing enough. The public isn't solving this problem, so we have to do these things to the animals. In 1977, same thing. The director of the shelter is saying that we can't tell people what we're doing to the animals because they'd all walk out and dump them on county roads because they would feel, we think that's worse, but they would think that killing them in the shelter was worse. In 1977, 24,000 animals were put to sleep, which is a huge number. Austin is a much bigger city than it was in 1977, and the city takes in 17,000 animals, so that's pretty massive. Again, we hate it. We are the ones that should be taking care of them, but until people accept responsibility, it'll get worse. 1983, animals brought to the Humane Society increased to 33,000 animals, and they're charging adoption fees on here, trying to advertise for people to come and adopt. 1992, we start to see spay-neuter show up in the paper, and low-cost spay-neuter, which is great. 94, the city takes back the shelter from the Humane Society. And it wasn't over the animal care, it was over business practices. I don't even know exactly what. 1995, now the city is saying the same thing. The public doesn't know what goes on in our shelter, and they don't want to know. If only we could keep them from being born in the first place. And that's, we all hear that now today. It's interesting that didn't really exist until the 90s. 98 starts to talk about not killing the pets. This is the beginning of the no-kill movement. 98 is when I moved here, but I was involved in spay-neuter, not in the no-kill movement. And the city at that point was killing 16,000 animals. So I don't know what happened between 92 and 98, but the number went down a little bit. 2007, 12,000 animals were euthanized at the Town Lake Animal Center, and there was complaints from the public about the budget going up for animal care because the city took over the shelter, but the actual live release rate was not. And then 2010, let's make Austin a no-kill city. There was a lot of support to try again to make Austin no-kill, and the city council voted on a resolution to make Austin a 90% city, which you guys probably know if you follow American Pets Alive at all. So I won't even go in. I was planning to go into all that, but there's so much more we need to talk about. 2012, this is the first time we're talking about actual specific needs and specific animals that are dying. It was just animals, dogs and cats, and now all of a sudden it's kittens that need help, and this is how you can help them. 2015, they're doing massive, heavily marketed adoption events. And 2016, we celebrated a 5-year milestone of being a no-kill city. And now, this is a key lesson later, but complaining continues, and that's okay. What we've found is that conflict never goes away, but it changes over time. And our job is to keep listening to it and to keep using that as a source of inspiration to try to do better. Do better. Nobody knows what happened in 1951. I didn't even know what happened in 1951. So we can't keep saying, well, we're so much better than that. We need to keep improving with the complaints that come and keep pushing us.
Hi, I'm Steve Adler, mayor here in the city of Austin. This is my friend Jackie. She's a guest at the Austin Animal Center until she can find her forever family. But until then, she needs our help. The Austin Animal Center provides shelter and care for our four-legged friends, but they need more than that. They need some volunteers, because volunteers are our partners in Lifesaving. They help create an environment of trust and compassion for animals and for people. So we need volunteers. We need volunteers to help walk dogs, large and small, to give them a break and to help them match with their forever families. We also need volunteers to distribute treats and puzzles and to keep the shy dogs company. So to learn more, sign up for volunteer orientation, visit austinanimalcenter.org and give our friends like Jackie here a helping paw.
So the mayor is on the TV, he's talking about nothing but helping animals and getting them adopted. He's not even talking about if they're going to get adopted. He's talking about helping them live long enough, live well while they wait for adoption. So I thought that was also really fascinating, kind of a milestone in our history. Then we were able to show that the no-kill policy actually made a huge impact on our economics in the city of Austin, $157 million economic impact between 2010 and 2017, I believe is when that came out. 2020, this also struck me that large and medium dogs having difficult time finding a forever home. What's fascinating about that is those are the dogs that were probably out there spreading rabies. And so when we started impoundment and we started trying to solve for dog problems, big dogs were probably a huge culprit, and now we're still struggling to save big dogs and to help them find homes. So I thought that was also really, I don't know, it just seems really interesting to me that it's kind of come full circle. And so that's kind of the end. We go from 1900, before 1900 to 2020, and let's talk about the lessons learned. So the biggest lesson learned for me is that the whole industry, and I know we all know that, but really thinking about it, that the whole entire industry is built around a disease that it's not at the stage that it was back when we started all this. It's not even at the stage in the early 1900s, late 1800s, yet we're still acting like it is. So Austin lived through a horrific few decades, actually many decades of a rabies scare. The city did the right thing to lock down all possible sources. The long outbreak lasted decades, probably 4, 5, 6 decades, and trained us really well to do things a very certain way to try to control rabies. And I think at this point in our history, we need to really think, why are we still doing this? I think we got trained and we're continuing to do it, but I'm not sure that we are taking our head out of the sand and looking at the whole picture again and wondering if this is the right way to go. So this is probably maybe too much information, but timeline. So we've got rabies starting in the late 1800s. We have a rabies scare in 1900, outbreak in probably 1930s to 1950s, and then now we're back down to minimal rabies in our community. Biggest dog problem at that point, if you think of each of those as the timeline on the top going downward. So 1800s, there's rogue nuisance dogs, and then the 1900 era, some dogs are carrying rabies, and then we get into the outbreak, a large percentage of dogs are carrying rabies, and now we're back down to a very slight chance of rabies. But now we've got a different problem. We've got dogs dying in our shelters. Solutions that we've implemented over time, they used to just shoot the nuisance dogs. If you had a dog that was trying to attack a child or was trying to bite your cow or whatever, that dog just got shot. During the rabies scare, a whole bunch of dogs got shot on suspicion, and then we rounded them up in shelters and killed them and created a leash law to try to solve for the large percentage of dogs that were positive. And then now we're down to minimal rabies, but the solutions that we have in place are really very similar to what they were during the epidemic. Unintended consequences, valuable pets. In 1800s, if you're shooting dogs on the street, valuable pets might be killed. When you start to shoot a whole bunch of them, more valuable pets are going to be killed. You bring them to a shelter. You start to see other diseases pop up. Distemper was popping up a lot, and lots of innocent dogs are being killed, and we're still doing that today. Government perception that, if you think about the shooting dogs that are causing a problem, it makes sense. The government perception back in the early 1900s is we hated to do it. And then you start getting kind of annoyed that the public is wanting their dogs and cutting the wires, and you're just trying to get your job done. And then, kind of now in this era, we're at a place where we're blaming the public for not being responsible. The public perception, I think, is the most fascinating, and that was probably 100 articles that I read, is that they started with everybody's on the same page. Yeah, you got a dog that's killing a cow, you got to get rid of that dog. Now, and then in the early 1900s, they were horrible. They were horrified that their dog might be shot. And then they continued to be horrified that dogs would be shot, and they were horrified by the inhumane conditions, and then they continued to be horrified, and they still continue to be horrified. So it's really fascinating that that perception really hasn't changed over time. Another lesson learned is that people love animals and have always loved animals. And I stumbled across this article from 1981, and I think it is so fascinating because this is a conversation we continue to have. Is it the right thing to do to save animals that are hurt? And this article was clearly saying, yes, this dog has like 4 broken legs from being run over, but it's part of the family and should be saved. Lesson learned. We have enough homes for all the pets in needs. We've done 2 research projects over the last few years, and one was with a Harvard intern and through a Harvard intern project, and it was studying the gap between supply and demand of animals in our community. And the supply and demand of near adoption ready dogs could be as large as 5 to 1, and the gap is growing. The second one that we did was with the University of Denver, and they found that 94% of people that responded to a survey reported they would consider obtaining their next pet from a shelter or a rescue organization. That was a random survey in Austin. And if you think about that number juxtaposed next to the population of Austin, that's a massive number of adopters that are in Austin. The second lesson learned in that adopter area is that there are even enough homes for the non-near adoption ready animals. And what I mean by that are the ones that need something done to them before they can be adopted, or they might even have an ailment that they're get adopted with. And this little dog, there was part of that research study was that adopter satisfaction and looking at what do adopters of challenged animals think after they're quote unquote stuck with the animal. And the study concluded that neither the happiness nor the attachment of owners to their dogs were significantly different for adopters of medical consult or behavior consult dogs than for dogs not requiring a medical or behavioral consult at the time of adoption. And we do consults for something that an adopter is going to have to do once they get home, which I think is pretty interesting. This little dog is a distemper dog, and she was adopted, and I thought you might want to see this video of her. So clearly a pretty happy dog, even though she's very challenged. Oh, sorry. So a recap of Austin history, we started with exterminating animals, trying to exterminate rabies and consequently dogs in the process, and we moved all the way up to where we got to a really high live release rate and were able to focus on the quality of life for big dogs. And then we also found the public wanted animals back then, and the public still wants animals. The whole no-kill movement in Austin is based on the premise that every living creature has one purpose in life, and that's to continue living. And you can think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but the very basic need of any living creature, humans, anybody, is to stay alive and then have the things you need to stay alive. And then you start working up in terms of luxury. And this also really helped me understand where a lot of our current conflict comes from in the industry. And thinking about this space of extermination and extreme suffering in shelters and in pounds, it's the foundation, it's the broken foundation of the entire system that we're built on, and all of the fixes that we've been doing since then. So, oh shoot, wonder why it's not doing this. Oh, there it is, okay. So I believe there's two philosophies that are driving this movement, and one is that we can't save them all, and that we're never going to be able to, and it's inevitable that the shelter industry, is going to have to be the ones to put them down. And if you think about the things that we've tried to create since the beginning of time for that, the first humane law in Texas was in '89. That was the first law that said shelters have to actually do something with the dogs and cats in the shelter, feed them, don't put a chicken in the same cage as the dog, stuff like that. It was pretty basic. That was 1989. And ASV guidelines, I appreciate what the ASV guidelines are doing because they're fighting this inertia from inhumane care and trying to say you need to do certain things to take care of animals in shelters. And that was a void at the time, and it in a lot of places continues to be a void. And then you've got the rise of socially conscious animal sheltering, and that, I believe, also it's a reaction to extreme suffering in shelters. You have philosophy number 2, which is what we espouse, and that is that the shelter is not supposed to be for any kind of disposal. Of course, there's always going to be a euthanasia, but that's a different kind of disposal than disposable pets. And you think about the things that have happened here in Austin to try to support that, and they are based on that philosophy. They're based on that goal. And so when I look at this, I see the conflict between the two pillars going down, and it seems pretty natural. If you don't believe that every pet is savable, then you're not going to create anything that is going to save 100% of them, if that makes sense. And if you believe that they should get out and get alive, you're not going to prioritize necessarily that they have a perfect life in the shelter in order to get out alive. So there's a conflict that exists. And again, public wants pets, and public still wants pets. And then we've been doing some independent research on budgeting and trying to understand why our system is so broken. And budgeting, I think, is a huge culprit. And budgeting continues and was always at that level back when I was talking about the one guy who had to go pick up all the dogs, he had to shoot them all, and he had to hang out at the shelter, didn't really have time to feed them or clean them. We continue to fund our shelters in a way that supports extermination and suffering. And we did some research pulling together budgets from large cities. And we have a whole bunch of cities, but this is just a snapshot of a few. And comparing animal services and the increase in animal services over 8 to 10 years and the increase in services, other city services in that same city. So we looked at, this is with sanitation department. So you can see the sanitation department over that time period got massive increases, and animal care services got a lot of increases. When I look at the cities listed here, I know they had massive increases for their shelter, but it still barely made a blip compared to sanitation. Then we compared it to parks departments, and same thing. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything on there and give you a second to look at that. So, and we do a leadership class, and in our last leadership class, there was a woman from Kentucky, and she said, we're still funded to just take them in and kill them. How many people in the room are funded at that level, that there's no more money than just enough to actually take them in, hold them for 3 days, feed and clean, and then get rid of them? Is there anybody willing to raise their hand? Okay. And how many people have enough funds to do everything they want to do and get them all out alive? Well, okay, well, yeah. Okay, so lessons learned. We've got a lot going on in our industry, and one of the things that has really struck me over the last few years is just how little infrastructure we have to support an industry that has such a massive responsibility to not only care for animals well, but then also put them into homes and do that well, and take care of people who are in crisis and needing to surrender their pets. Sorry. So thinking about processes, if you think about it in a way that this death, suffering, extermination is the baseline, and I keep thinking of it as a magnet because everything keeps pulling us down to that common denominator, and it depends on which side of the spectrum you're on, if you're in the suffering camp or the dead camp, but both of those things keep pulling us back downward, and all of our efforts that we're trying to go up, we keep getting pulled back down by that. So one of the first things we have to do is choose which philosophy we're trying to achieve. And neither are wrong. They're both better than what we had before. But I think when we don't choose, we end up with conflict in our community. We end up with people wanting things like in Austin, we have people wanting things for our animals that are not possible when we're trying to get them all out alive. And you may have the other. When you're trying to do everything to treat your pets well in the shelter, you're going to have people in the community wanting you to save them all. And when we choose and we can state that, then we can prioritize and help our community mobilize to help us. Activities and goals have to match the goal. I mean, the activities have to match the goals, and you have to be measuring them so that you can show that you're making an impact in what you're doing. And then choices have to be made between saving the masses or saving each one well. Perfectly is probably an overstatement. And at the same time, preventing suffering and extermination. How many, this is rhetorical, but I don't know anybody who's trying to save them all who's not accused of, doctoring the numbers or just caring only about the numbers and causing pain and suffering when they're trying to save lives. And it's on us to combat that rhetoric by proving that we're not causing suffering and we're not causing death, depending on which playing field you're on. And those activities have to have checks and balances to stay away from the magnet. So we are our worst enemy when we mess up by accident and we accidentally get closer to that bottom line of extreme suffering and a lot of death. And so I think of that as a process. That's the process that's missing. We don't have all this written down. We don't have the activities written down. We're not measuring our progress to our goals. We're not articulating the choices that we're making, and we're not showing how we're not going to make it worse for the animals, and we need to get better at that. Another lesson learned is that we're going to fail in this industry, and we as an industry have a really low tolerance for failure, and it's not conducive to innovation, and we've got to get over that somehow. At least that's what I believe, because failure is a necessary part of reaching any big goal that you're going after. And I have a little thing on my computer, a little fortune cookie thing on my computer, and it says, failure is not defeat until you stop trying, and it's absolutely true. And the key, let's look at a couple things. So at APA, we have failed, and constantly we fail. One big one was in 2012. We had a bottle baby pan-luke outbreak, and we lost about half, maybe a little bit more, of our kittens in our nursery. And it was horrifying. The kittens were suffering, and it was completely demoralizing to our staff and volunteers. We think about NASA, and I looked it up, and 3.2% of their astronauts die trying to get into space. There's no life or death happening there. That's just us trying to attain something really amazing, and it's all due to something that they messed up. And so the human life is, I guess, somewhat quantifiable about how much you're willing to risk to be able to achieve a big goal. In hospitals, we do the same thing. You have a deathly ill person, and the hospital's discovered, you put them in an ICU, guess what? They might get MRSA. If you don't admit them, though, they probably are going to die if they really need to be in an ICU. So I think it's important we put our work in perspective and try to learn from mistakes, learn from failure, and try to and shed a light on the difference between organizations that are failing and not learning and not continually trying to improve, and the difference between organizations that are failing animals and have no interest in doing better. And what happens if we all just give up every time we fail? Then we're never going to reach our goal. Another lesson learned is steal what works to save lives now. We offer a lot of support for organizations. We want to help organizations through this horrible part of the puberty of no-kill, is what we call it. And so we offer a lot of resources, and you'll get to see out in the hall all about that. But I know there's a lot of organizations. Best Friends is here. There's Maddie's Fund has a huge component of resources and other apprenticeships that are offered to try to help. So take advantage of those. And then I would also add that sustainability is bigger than our shelters. We were worried before Dawn came and joined us in Austin as the shelter director that we didn't have a lot of infrastructure in place at the city of Austin. So we had achieved this amazing success leading the country in life-saving, and with turnover at the city shelter director level, at the assistant director level, at the manager level, city manager level, assistant city manager level, city council level, almost all of those layers turned over, and we didn't have the processes in place to make sure that our work would be able to continue. And I believe that in order for a city to be sustainable, we need to document all of our processes. We need to make sure that everything is written down. We need to think beyond our borders. We're not just a little island in Texas. We try to be a little island in Texas, but we're not. We're surrounded by a sea of need. And how do we create enough infrastructure to be able to help more than just our city limits? Policy and decision makers must be informed enough to keep evolving, or at least to keep where you are. And even though our politicians, obviously, the mayor is doing a video about adopting a dog, are very involved, they're not necessarily very informed. And so they wouldn't know if we dropped to 85%, they would not know how to fix it, because they don't know enough, and we don't have it written down, and we don't have a handbook for them to follow. So we've got to, that's one of the things we've got to do. We've got to write it down and make sure that that's in place. And we have to move from this is kind of the epiphany I got from reading all of these articles in the Statesman, is that we have to move from being a reactionary movement and move into a transformative movement. Everything we do is a reaction to this model of sheltering that happened 100 years ago. And we keep adding these little Band-Aids on to try to make it better, but it's all reacting to a system that wouldn't have ever happened if we didn't have a rabies outbreak. And so what do I mean by transformative? You remember this slide? And we're looking at these two philosophies and trying to drive towards separate goals and hoping that we'll get enough of a mix that it will all work out in the end. And I'm thinking that we need to figure out a totally different way to support our community's animals, and that if we do that, all of this becomes obsolete. And I think that we're at a place where maybe we can start thinking about that, and maybe we can transform animal welfare, dog and cat, companion animal welfare, especially homeless companion animals, in a way that we've never thought of before, because we haven't had the space to even think about it because we're too busy reacting to the old system. And so how do we get past all that? And I would challenge you to think about what you would do differently if you were faced with a decision in 1930, or actually it was 1900 when the shelter was opening and there wasn't a rabies outbreak. What do you think would have happened to us? And if you think about it, I wonder if we'd even have shelters at all. Would we have a place for pets to go to do 10-day rabies quarantine? Sure, because there's rabies out there, and it existed all throughout the 1800s. There would definitely need to be a place for rabies animals to go for their quarantine, but now we have vaccines. We didn't have vaccines when we started sheltering, so we had to impound all these animals and get them off the streets because we didn't have a vaccine to protect our community immunity. We have that now. We probably would have community pet hospitals instead of shelter clinics. All the broken animals that we're trying to take care of in a shelter and rehome them, maybe we'd have community pet hospitals. Short-term shelters like we do for people experiencing homeless, give them 30 days, 60 days, 90 days to get back on their feet. Foster networks to take in pets directly. Community behavior support available. Family assistance programs to keep pets and their families together, tying back into what Kristen said about that One Health. Pets are part of the family. We know 65% of people believe that their pet is as important to their family as a sibling. That's huge. Why are we treating them like they're disposable? And so I challenge you over the next 3 days to think about how would you fix this broken foundation? How would you try to make it better? What can we collectively do together to make it better? And we put I think in the Whova app, there's a form to fill out just with an email. And if you want to stay involved in this, if you're up to your eyeballs in the work that you're doing, that's fine too. You don't need to worry about it. But if you're interested in thinking about maybe starting over, I'd like to get an email list going of that. And so the last lesson learned is that even with the thinking outside the box and thinking about a different type of future and thinking about a different type of present, we're still stuck here. We're still stuck with 100 animals coming in a day and the risk of them dying, that magnet pulling us back down to killing or suffering, and we've got to keep working. We have to work as hard as we can, and we need to be brave. We need to be brave enough to risk failure. We need to be smart and write things down and take risk with calculated intentions, and we need to use our community. We need to be part of the community rather than siloed away from the community, and I believe that we're seeing so much progress in the last few years. I believe that this is just a tipping point, and we're going to continue blowing it out of the water. I think that's it. So thank you.